I'm totally a Bible nerd, which is wild as a queer feminist woman person in the 21st century. Like, I need my Bible. Like, that's how I stay grounded.
Reverend Ann, welcome to the podcast. Welcome to Applying Jesus. I am so thankful that you agreed to be here with me.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. And I actually already asked you my first question, what the weather is like, but just to let our listeners know, you're all the way in Buffalo, New York, so it's cold.
Yeah. I live in Buffalo for the last 3 years, and it's cold, and there's a lot of snow on the ground. And um, I'm actually happy about that because that's what winter is supposed to be like here. In the last couple of years has not been like that. So in this part of the world, you need a good blanket of snow for the earth to do what it needs to do. So I'm happy that we're getting that.
Yeah, and that's a great perspective, being in not only in the South but from the South. We don't know what to do with anything below 40 degrees. We just don't. I'm glad that we're taking this opportunity to connect with each other after I forget if we've had one or two conversations since I guess I initially reached out to SURJ. And let me back up and, just make sure everybody knows you're with Standing Up for Racial Justice.
Showing Up for Racial Justice. Yeah, I'm the faith organizing coordinator for SURJ.
So with SURJ, I went and searched in 2020 after the world broke open and George Floyd was murdered, and my lead pastor said, my boss said, go figure out how to give white people a space to process, because we people of color need to not be around y'all for a little bit. And so in my Google searching, and not just Google searching, but somebody had specifically pointed me to SURJ, and I found your toolkits. And so you and I got to talking, and I definitely want to spend some time on the racial justice work that you're involved in, but you are also involved in something very specific that I want to explore more, because it's an uncomfortable conversation for me, is defund the police.
Yeah.
So, but before we get there, so tell me, SURJ's whole motto is home for white people working for justice. When we fight racism, we all win. Yeah. And that to me definitely goes back to it benefits everyone to get rid of the systemic institutions and policies and everything that we've baked into our culture, whiteness, if you will. It benefits everyone to get rid of it. And I've talked to a lot of people of color about that. I don't often have the opportunity to really talk to somebody, a white person, who knows a whole heck of a lot more than I do. So I'm glad that you and I are talking. But tell me how you joined up with SURJ and what brought you to this work.
Well, again, thank you so much for the invitation to be here and just to be in conversation with you about all of these amazing questions. I think it's so important, and I'm really glad that you found us. So thank you for that. I have been doing justice work in some form or fashion since my late teen years. So I'm almost 62. So that's 35 plus years of some form of fashion of trying to make the world a better place, trying to contribute to building a world where people are safe and they have what they need to thrive, and that they're loved. Ultimately, that's what I'm about in the world, is doing my part for that. And that looked like all kinds of things. My initial immersion into justice work was in the sanctuary movement in the 80s, in the early 90s, the late 80s and early 90s. And solidarity work with Central America, and that gradually also encompassed like immigrant rights work, economic justice, worker justice, being in solidarity with indigenous self-determination movements, all different kinds of things, ways of contributing to that world, that better world, that I think that God wants for us. I really think that God wants for us here and now, not later, somewhere else, but here, like right now, in our lived lives in these bodies. I came to this work with SURJ in 2014 in the aftermath of Michael Brown's murder in Ferguson, Missouri. I had been having like deep discernment conversations with my mentor who had died that summer, Dr. Vincent Harding, like talking to him as an ancestor, just in general, you know, with his death. But then after Michael Brown's murder, you know, deeply asking Dr. Harding, like, what am I supposed to do now? What's my call now in this moment? And I began to really hear clearly for the first time that call from particularly Black women in my life and Black women in the movement, that white people really needed to be working with other white people. Yeah. And I'm sure that I had been told that many times before, but something about the intersections of all those things in that moment, I was actually able to be open to that call. There were some other white folks we were living in Denver at the time. There were other white folks I had been doing some organizing with who were in similar places, like, well, how do we actually respond to that call? So we began to meet together to try to figure out how to do that. And some of the, one of the founders of SURJ actually came to Denver during the Creating Change conference that was there in January of 2015. And they did a workshop for us, and they talked about calling people in instead of calling people out, like rooting our work in calling people in rather than shame and blame. And they talked about the need for white people to find our mutual interest. That's what we call it, what you were talking about earlier about like that we all have a stake, including white people. Like this is racism and white supremacy are systems that harm all of us in different ways, but they harm us too. They impact us as white people too. And so figuring out what our stake is, what our mutual interest is in getting free from these systems. And like the lineage of SURJ is also the lineage that Dr. Harding came out of with the Southern Freedom Movement and the and SNCC and these leaders that I wanted, these ancestors that I wanted, you know, I have called on and wanted to be surrounded with. And so we were like, let's become a chapter. Yeah. So we became a chapter in 2015, and I was sent to a gathering of chapter leaders at the Highlander Center on behalf of our chapter in August of 2015. Got to meet some amazing people, including some of the very first staff. That was the first time they were hiring staff in 2015. And was invited not long after to join the staff in a small like consulting role at that time. And now here we are, gosh, 6 some years later, and I'm the faith organizing coordinator. It's still a part-time role, so I hold a lot in 20 hours a week. But that's how I came into this job, was like asking the deep question, both of God, but also of you know, my dear ancestor mentor, Dr. Harding, like, how do I respond to this now? What's my call now? And prior to that, I had seen myself as like more of like this bridge, you know, that I could talk to the white folks about why they needed to come over and work with the impacted communities like immigrants or workers or what have you. And that my work was to be in solidarity with, which is a good orientation. Right. But this was a shift for me, like vocationally, to orient from well, I'm, to orient from, I'm in solidarity over here with these people to, no, I'm part of a movement and I need to like get more of my own people, more of the white folks along with us, because that's how we're going to win. Is we can get as many of us working on racial and economic justice as we can. We can actually build that world that God dreams of for us.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. To hear and receive something like to invite people in rather than call people out is just, it's almost counter-revolutionary in the sense that many activists that I follow, their whole job, call it prophetic, is to call people out. And if you really go back to what the prophets actually did, they were constantly inviting. They were, no, come back, come back. This is what God wants. This is what we are meant to do, and not just for us, but for everybody.
Our movement ancestor, Ann Braden, who was a mentor to one of the co-founders of SURJ, white Southern anti-racist organizer in the Southern Freedom Movement, says that that white people don't get involved in movement work because we've been guilted and blamed and shamed into it. Like we might come for a second and peek our nose in and then be like, no, this isn't for me. That we get involved and we stay because we've glimpsed a different world that we want to be a part of.
Yeah.
And like to your point, I think that's what the prophets are offering to the people, is like, this is the world that God wants for us. This is the world where everybody eats, everybody has a home, everybody is loved. Nobody is enslaved, nobody is in jail. Like we figured out how to hold each other in accountability in ways that don't cause further harm and violence. Like that's the world that I long for, but that I can see in our sacred stories that God longs for us too.
Is that reading the sacred stories and being connected with scripture and the work and the movement work of bringing that vision? Well, that's the whole point of this season of the podcast anyway. But is that what keeps you connected in your faith? Is that what keeps you in the church? Is that, how do you stay a Christian?
I ask myself that a lot, actually, because in the shedding of like white supremacy culture, there's so much white supremacy culture that within Christianity, it's like, what is left now? But yes, I would, for me anyway, and those sacred stories are so valuable and rich, especially once we get ourselves oriented to what I think they're really about, which is a people who are oppressed over and over again by Assyria, by Babylon, by Rome, by the empire du jour, trying to figure out what it means to be human, trying to figure out what it means to not only survive, but also like thrive as a people, as a community. How do we resist this in ways that, are still faithful to who we're called to be? And those are true of the stories of Jesus and Jesus's community as well. Those questions, those wrestlings. And I love that they don't always agree about what the best way to do that is. Like sometimes they're like, we should just build ourselves our own empire.
Right.
And that doesn't go very well, actually, if we pay attention. And to me, that's just, I just come back to that over and over and over again. And I think part of the reason for that is because when I was first like getting immersed as a teenager into movement work, into sanctuary work and immigration work, I went on a trip. I was 17, and our presbytery took a youth group. I grew up Presbyterian. Took a youth group from Arkansas down to the border to McAllen and Reynosa. And we spent a week building a helping to build in English what would be called like a service church. So there was a sanctuary, but also classroom space, a dental clinic, doctor's office, a library. Right. You know, it was a whole community center. And also laying down a concrete ramp and floor for someone who was living in a wheelchair. And this was in 1987. I'd never seen conditions like I had seen. It was like shanty towns, the colonias on the Mexican side of the border. And so we were driving back and forth every day, staying in a church in McAllen and driving back across to do that work. And the last night that we were in McAllen, we'd had this week and we were doing some like, not evaluation, but reflection, like biblical reflection. And one of the leaders read Matthew 25. When you do this for me. When you do this for the least of these, you do this for me. Yeah. And he started putting in the names of the people that we had worked with. And I just broke apart. And was like, this is what it means to be Christian, is to actually do this. You know, you have to actually take action. You have to live it out with your body. You know, our muscles were sore from tamping down the ground to lay the concrete, all this. And like, this is what it is. We serve, we contribute to a better world by doing stuff. Not even necessarily by believing stuff, but by the doing of the things. And so, you know, and so scripture has just been that for me ever since. Those touch points, like how am I supposed to show up? How did the people show up then? Yeah. So I'm totally a Bible nerd, which is wild as a queer feminist woman person in the 21st century. Like, I need my Bible. Like, that's how I stay grounded.
People are like, those two don't mesh, but they do. They really do. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of alternative commentary reading before I sermon prep, and it's not just eye-opening. That's to me where the transformation really happens. And I'm a Bible nerd too, so please come back and let's nerd out. Let's
totally.
I love that. Love that. Your trip down to the border, down to McAllen, it was interesting because our parent church has sponsored, and we've led, my family and I have led trips down there, down to the border with Texas and Mexico, and it's jarring, the abject, stark difference between the life my family and I live. And even the difference, I would say, the jump from, I would definitely classify us as upper middle class, and then the jump just down to middle class, and then you go down to lower middle class, and then all the way down into poverty. We weren't even interacting with people who were in abject poverty most of the time, and it was remarkable. It was just really, really remarkable. And the whole point of us doing the mission trip down there, was because people couldn't take off work to care for their kids during spring break. So we were going down there essentially to run a VBS and then help repair houses and that kind of thing. But, and it was stark to me. Not my first time. I'd been involved in other mission work, but I remember just being arrested in my mind to say, stop and think about this. The reason why you're here is because there's a totally different standard of living between people who live 4 hours from you and not even then, people that live in my neighborhood live 2 blocks from me. Yeah, absolutely. So it started my brain clicking. You don't have to go to Africa to experience that. Um,
And you don't even have to go to Mexico. You can just go to a different part of Houston,
Yep.
right? Or like here in Buffalo, the first time I visited here, they told me like Main Street, when you cross Main Street, you'll see the difference. And you do, like the east side is impoverished and black. And then there's this strip down the middle that, is middle class, upper middle class. There's definitely not the wealth here that there used to be. But that line is very clear.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I'm really grateful for is because one of the things that experience, and it's the same when I learned about the sanctuary movement the year before and what was happening in Central America and particularly in El Salvador, I wanted to know why. Like, why is the world like this? Because it seems to me it should not be. Like, yes, we were there to serve and to help, but it was also made clear to us, and I'm really grateful to the youth leaders and to the partners in Mexico to make it really clear, like, this is not the way the world should be.
Right.
And you're not here to like help these poor people because there's just always going to be poor people or whatever, but like to contribute to their efforts to create dignity and care in their lives.
Yeah.
And to be super, super clear that this is not the way the world should be, and it's not the way God wants the world to be.
Right. Right.
And so that the question, well, why is it this way? I took that question to college with me, even though I was an English major, up the road from y'all at SMU. When I took like my required, you have to take a poli-sci class and you have to take this class. Like I took those opportunities to explore, and I got involved in Dallas in the sanctuary movement there, and was mentored by folks who had a clear analysis about why things are the way they are. The protection of essentially like the protection of white power and wealth, protection of capitalism. And I'm really grateful that I had those mentors who could give me some clear analysis, which has continued to grow over time. Like there's plenty of things that I still did not understand and still don't understand because I think sometimes we have that experience, we might ask that question, and then the people around us don't have the wherewithal to know how to answer it. Right. And so we end up with answers that aren't super helpful, like theologically, well, we'll always have the poor with us. Like that's actually not a legitimate answer to the suffering.
Right. It's like the ultimate proof texting. Yes, Jesus did say that, but that's not really what he meant. It's like, it's not, he didn't mean for us to accept that, because he was very clear that we should, that not just, in his time, but throughout the history of the Hebrew people, that they were to be a totally different type of society in the way that they related to one another that was radical to the nations around them. And then then it got boiled down to purity laws and eating laws and dressing laws and that kind of thing. So, but I think my big question in my mind is, were you raised in a house to ask questions? Or do you think you were just created to ask these questions? I'm wondering about your upbringing in terms of, were your parents those kind of folks that were involved in progressive movements for their time, or are you and you are, but are you a unique soul?
I'm a 4 on the Enneagram, so of course I'm a unique soul.
Yes. I'm a 3, so there you go.
No, that's such a great question, and I think about it a lot because my parents, they aren't like activists or anything like that, so in that sense, I'm kind of unique in that way in my family, but I'm also not. Like I've learned as an adult that my grandparents, my daddy's parents, my grandfather was a Methodist minister and served all over Arkansas. And my daddy remembers when he was a kid, how vocal my grandfather was about opposing segregation, especially when the Little Rock High School crisis happened in 1957, and hearing him and my grandmother like argue with other ministers about what the proper response to that should be, like the just and faithful response to that should be. So like my parents like quietly carried those commitments in ways that I didn't really understand until I was an adult. Of just like when I was little, one of my best friends at school was a little Black boy, you know, sweetest person, and he came to my birthday party. And I didn't know when I was 6, and I didn't know until I was a grown-up, like just a few years ago, that for my 6th birthday party, there were a lot of kids invited and only 5 came. And that was because all of the white people in town called them up and said, if Talvin comes, we're not bringing our kids. And they said, well, fine, then you're not coming.
Wow. Yeah.
You know, so it was little things like that. My mom was real outspoken about like inclusive language. She was a church musician, and inclusive language in hymns and in anthems when she was directing choirs and stuff, and was involved in some of the work with the Presbyterian women at the national level in the 80s. So there was like interest in the world, and questions were good, and exploring was good. And I know that when I took it to the next level and got arrested in college and told them about it later, that after I got out of jail, that they were a little shocked. But, you know, within, you know, a day or two, they were writing me a letter about how proud they were of me, that I was that committed to something and believed in it and cared about it that much. But don't do anything to lose your student loans, because that would be bad. Which, fair enough.
Right. Healthy boundaries. Yes. Wow. So you had the dual DNA track of faith and activism wherever you are. And I think that's so important to point out to people. My youngest and I were watching Mr. Rogers' video of, it was him and a little boy in a wheelchair singing a song. I don't remember it. I probably should, because I watch Mr. Rogers all the time. But it's like, I like you, or something like that.
Just the way you are.
Yes, yeah. And then fast forward to when he was being presented with a big award. The little boy, obviously now a grown man, presented him with the award. And what struck me is that, you know, Mr. Rogers was a serious activist, but he did it in such a subversive way. Yeah. That and for I think the people in our community, the people who are listening, it's important to know, like your parents, you don't necessarily have to be. I mean, it's great if you are out there protesting and you're out there getting arrested, or you're although I don't know that we encourage getting arrested, but for good reason, good trouble, right? But it's really, the important thing is to live these values out day by day, hour by hour, not just in a performative way, but you can make an impact on the people around you, and that collectively builds up and changes society.
Yeah, and I think, you know, in like the popular culture mind of what activism or organizing is, it is only I'm out at the protest with my sign, yeah, and then I get arrested, and that's all it is. Like, right. and there's actually so much more, like, you know, that's necessary to build a whole new world. Like, those are useful things to do at times. Yeah. And also there's so much more that needs to happen, like right. One-on-one conversations, like how we raise our children, like making sure that people are fed, like people who are healers offering their services, you know, for free or for sliding scale to folks who are doing the work, right. Because it's really, really hard. You know, I could not have done it without multiple therapists and spiritual directors and herbalists and Western medicine to help me get through, because it's hard work.
Yeah.
Who's feeding, who's taking care of the kids while folks are in these meetings. Like, there's so many ways that we can contribute, and not only out in the street with the sign, which is useful, but also like not accessible for everyone as well. So we want a movement that is as diverse and broad and beautiful as the people that make it up, and to recognize that it takes so many kinds of ways of showing up, so many kinds, like the podcast that we do for SURJ, the word is resistance, like telling the stories in a new way, giving people the resources to figure out how to show up differently in a school board meeting, at the board meeting at your church. Like, those are some of the places where, like, we need people showing up the most. And so how we do that, how we nurture people into doing that, to take that same energy with the sign in the street and take that into where decisions are being made about people's lives, how we spend money, and how we're going to relate to one another.
To me, it sounds like more of an advocacy role, because we do have access to those places. That we are in school board meetings because we can be. And when I say we, I mean me as a white person.
White folks.
Yeah, we are in those spaces already. But also so are people of color. And so it's knowing that balance of when you're the one speaking up, or you're the one in collusion with a person of color to get them to the platform and the microphone.
I think how we try to understand it is SURJ is like, and it can be tricky to figure out sometimes, but that's the importance of relationship, like deep ongoing relationship conversation with folks of color, about how we do this work together, because the burden cannot be only on people of color to be the ones disrupting the meeting or pointing out the thing. Like, that's not a fair burden. Like, we as white folks have to do our share, not because we're going to do it for them, but because we have to for us. Right. Coming back again to that place of mutual interest, like, we have to speak up for us, for our own stake in it. And so how we build that coalition, to do that together, and figuring out the, like, am I showing up white saviory? Am I taking over? Like, but like that requires a relationship and conversation, and being willing to mess it up. Like, sometimes we make mistakes. Like, I've done it, like not spoken when I should, or spoken too much when I shouldn't have. And relationship, like a deep trusting relationship, can hold that of, like, we're gonna screw it up. That's just, like, we're not perfect.
Absolutely. Nor should there be any kind of self-expectation that we should be.
But I think that there is. I think that for a lot of white folks, they think they have to show up perfectly, and that is part of what prevents us from showing up. It is the mindset of white supremacy culture and of capitalism, that if we can't do it perfectly, it's not worth doing. And I think also it's an embedded message in Christianity, like, either you're a sinner or you've been converted to goodness, and you can't lose that, or you're in big trouble. Even in more progressive Christian spaces, that message is still kind of there. Like, you're converted to something, maybe it's progressive causes, or or what have you, but that message is still there. Like, you could screw that up, you could backslide, and then we throw people out when that happens. And that kind of good, not good posturing that is kind of endemic to white Western Christianity is not actually useful for getting us where we need to go. Miriam Kawa says she's not interested in being good. She's interested in taking actions that like make the world better. And I think that's so helpful of like, am I being a good person? Well, maybe in this second, but in the next, maybe like that's not even a useful gauge.
Right.
And I think when we look at the stories in our Bible, going back to the Bible, going back to our sacred texts, that's not the question for them either.
Yeah.
It's not how can I be perfect, but how can I be faithful? And when we screw it up, there's always the opportunity to come back.
Right.
And there's even like these cycles in the Hebrew Bible of the 7-day Sabbath, the 7-year Shemitah release, and then the 50-year Jubilee of like, we're just going to embed this into our practice because we know that we're not perfect and things will get out of whack. And so every 7 days, every 7 years, every 50 years, we're all gonna come back.
I've been reading and listening and receiving messages, and it all seems to be this theme, this thread that it feels like God keeps pulling at in my soul, where it's honoring the Imago Dei, honoring the image of God. Mm-hmm. In order to do that, you don't just honor God, you don't just honor yourself, you honor other people. And that's the Trinitarian cycle to me. That to me, that's if you're doing those three things, if you're honoring, not morally doing the best that you can, or going and doing the most mission trips, or doing the most, whatever, fill in the blank, doing the most, right? Although that's extremely important, but it's the act of honoring God with your body, with your mind, with your heart, in relationship to yourself and to other people. That's where to me, that's what keeps me a Christian, that's the essence of the faith. And we just had this conversation, my husband and I just had this conversation with our middle daughter, who's 15, and she asked us, it's a really interesting question. She has a friend who, he's Hispanic, but he constantly uses the N-word, if you know the N-word that I'm talking about. And she was like, but, I don't feel like I should say anything to him about that. And I said, well, we talked for a while, and I asked her, how does your friend who is black standing right there feel about it? And she said, well, she doesn't like it. She doesn't like him. And I said, well, you have to remember that the history behind that word, and you have to understand the impact that it has on other people and on this young man who is using this word. Mm-hmm. And it gets back to this idea of, for me, and I would like to think that I actually said this to her. I don't remember exactly, but that you have to honor other people. You have to honor their humanity and remember that they are human. And words like that make them less than human because they're making other people less than human. So, it's interesting trying to, at the very basic level for me, is help these 3 young women become people who are aware of the world around them and themselves in this world and how best to relate to it. Mm-hmm. It's really, and then, all the other things that ministry brings along with it. But, that's my basic task when I wake up every morning. But it's some days the best I can do is to make sure that they understand what the call is really is a return. And this is something that this now the 3rd episode we're recording, and in the first 2 episodes this was the same theme, is that it goes back to recognizing humanity in someone else. And if you recognize the humanity in someone else, that will force you to recognize the humanity in yourself. And so if you understand systems of oppression against someone else, then your eyes will be open to the system, what those systems of oppression are doing to you as well. Grind culture is a result of capitalism, and that affects everybody.
That affects everybody. That's right.
It's just
I sometimes say that we have the call, and this is a way of summing up what you're saying, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself, which is both Jesus and also deeply rooted in the Hebrew Bible, which sometimes gets overlooked, and I just want to name. It is part of the Shema, which is like one of the most important pieces of like Jewish practice and tradition. And love your neighbor is also, in the Torah.
Yeah.
So Jesus is like reaching deep into his tradition to offer, like, how are we actually going to live together under the boot of the Roman Empire?
Yeah.
And so one of the things I say is about like white supremacy, and is that for white people, like, why part of why we need to do this work is that white supremacy disrupts our ability to love our neighbor, because it teaches us to be afraid of our neighbor, to hate our neighbor, to be suspicious of our neighbor, to surveil our neighbor, to distrust our neighbor, to think that our neighbor is constantly a threat, especially if they don't look like us or dress like us, or have a body like us or ability like us, whoever us is here. And so we're actually being incapacitated. We as white people are being incapacitated in our ability to love our neighbor, which is the primary call in our tradition.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's actively preventing us from being able to do that.
Yeah.
And so, like, I love what you're trying to, teach your daughter, like that reorientation.
Yeah.
To loving our neighbor. And that has to look like action that changes people's material lives. It's not about like a warm, fuzzy feeling,
Right.
but changes in not how we act, how our institutions act, and how we live, how we embody it.
Yeah, and something that's been, to use a Southern phrase, stuck in my craw for a while is I feel like the church could truly be the church's best self, the bride of Christ, if we were doing more than meeting needs in a disaster, if we were doing more than just providing food and basic services. Our second episode was with a pastor of a Methodist church in Galveston, and they have built basically this whole, when you mentioned the church that you went down and helped with in McAllen that had all the different services, but their primary focus is to help people who are experiencing homelessness and get them housed, because that's the solution to homelessness, is to give people security and a place to stay. But it's this. We work with an organization down the street from our church that they're like Meals on Wheels for kids who are not able to go to public school. So they're not old enough to go to public school. So pre-K age. And most of the families they deliver to live in food deserts in Houston, the fourth largest city in the nation. And my thought is, okay, that's fantastic work. We need to keep doing that. But also, who are the land developers and the business owners and those people who are creating the food deserts because because of gentrification, because of economies of scale, because they're not building grocery stores that are affordable. And so the church has to step in and do that work. Why are we not lobbying? So my hope and my dream is that we can look at the systems beneath the reason why we have to respond in crisis.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
I'm sure you know this story. It's like we're all standing here at the river, and the bodies are coming down the river, and we're all doing our part to go rescue the bodies from the river, and to heal them, and to provide the care for the wounds and whatever.
Yeah.
But where are the people who are going upriver to figure out what in the world is happening, that there are injured drowning folks in the river? People have got to eat,
Right,
people need their bodies tended to.
right.
And also, we need the people who are going upriver that are like, what's actually happening here? Oh, the factory is harming people
Right,
with really poor working conditions.
right.
Or the developers refuse to build a grocery store here because they say that, and this is a literal thing that I heard come out of the mayor, representative, the mayor of Denver's mouth, because the education levels aren't high enough in the Black neighborhood to support a good grocery store. Like, yeah, I know. I saw your face. And so it's both tending to the wounds that this harmful system creates, and also stopping the harmful system from harming. Both
Right.
of those at the same time.
The work of Greg Boyle at Homeboy Industries, and how he's focused on healing and wholeness, not improving their socioeconomic level. It's like when we get down to the root of it, when we treat the wounds of somebody, of a human, when we treat the actual need, when we address those needs, then that other stuff just kind of comes along. We don't have to solve all the issues. We have to solve the core ones, which our faith addresses.
And then we all benefit, to circle back to the very beginning of our conversation, right? It's like everybody benefits when we stop the harm to those most harmed by systemic oppression. Like everybody actually benefits.
Applying Jesus is hosted and produced by Amy Vogel, Director of Spiritual Growth for Upper Room Heights. We record at Chapelwood United Methodist Church Digital Studio in Houston, Texas. We hope something you heard today has deepened your faith, opened your eyes, and led you to not only knowing God in a more expansive way, but shift how you connect, especially with those who are easy to overlook. To find out more about Amy and our church community, go to www.urheights.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Remember, we love you, and there's nothing you can do about it.